Well, good afternoon, and welcome to DataGene's first of a series of webinars designed for people that are working in the field and breeding enthusiasts to think about some of the new traits that have been recently released in April 2020. I have the great honor to be joined by Rowan Butler today from Holstein, Australia, and Rowan will share the presentation with us. Great to see people online from a variety of places around the country. Thanks for joining us today. If you do have any questions, just pop them through on the chat box, and we'll certainly go through and answer as many as we possibly can through the webinar. I'll just share my screen and we can get started. Very good. So we should, so today's topic is all about the Rump ABV. The Rump ABV is one of the type composites that was released in April and has some new features about it. And it's a great chance to kind of go through and explain this trait in a little bit more detail. Well, if we think about type overall, you know, type is quite an important component. There's 22 of the ABVs that we deliver at DataGene are related to type, in addition to 5 composite traits. And the reason why type is so important is because of the relationship between overall type and the structural soundness and the longevity of cows. It's one of the strong predictors of survival in cows in Australia, and we know that having longer lasting cows helps us to reduce the heifer rearing costs and also increases the production levels from the herd. So having longer lasting cows and improved overall type is important. In the April 2020 ABV release, there were some updated models applied for Holsteins and red breeds and Guernseys. These weren't applied to Jerseys because we have different sources of information for Jersey, but for the Holsteins, red breeds and Guernseys, there were some new features and new models that were applied in April. In terms of type, the new and updated composite type ABVs that we saw in April included a new rump composite, a new dairy strength composite, a new feet and legs composite. But we also had 2 other composites that have been with us for a while but received an update. So memory system was updated as well as overall type to use a greater range of information that we received from Holstein, Australia. So if we think about the rump in particular, this is just one of the composites, and it contributes to the overall picture, the overall type ABV of the animal. But we're looking at some individual traits, things like pin width, pin set, and loin strength. Now, rump score is a score that's actually delivered to us by Holstein Australia. And that score is really the main piece of information that contributes to the rump ABV. And that information has been provided now for over a decade. Cows that have been classified sort of after around 2007 have this rump score information. We do have a multi-trait type model, which means we use information from different sources to deliver that composite. And for animals where we don't have a rump score, so for example, animals that were scored before 2007, we would use the individual components pin width, pin set, and loin strength to estimate the rump composite overall. Now you might ask about thurl. So thurl placement is one of the traits that you also might expect to see in rump. We don't have a thurl placement ABV, but it does contribute to the overall score because it's included as part of the rump score that's evaluated by classifiers at Holstein Australia. I'm going to hand over to Rowan Butler now from Holstein Australia to go into some details about each of the individual components and explain exactly what they mean when we look at a cow. Rowan is Holstein Australia's Genetic Improvement and Research Manager, but he's also transitioning to the role as CEO later this month. And so it's certainly great to have Rowan's expertise online to help us understand the details about the classification of each of the traits. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Rowan, now.
Excellent, thanks for that, Michelle. And so I think this is a great opportunity to talk about the rump angle and the rump traits with the development that the implementation that DataGen have put in place over the last, it's a long period, but over the last few months where we've implemented those traits, and now we start to have the opportunity to have breeding values in that space. And it's a great opportunity to look at how these traits are evaluated and how we end up with the breeding values for them. So we'll start with rump angle, and this is a trait that's been evaluated for a long period of time, and it really talks about the pin bone in relation to the hip bone. And if you're looking at the angle on those pictures, it talks about a 1 being high where those pin bones are particularly high, or a lot significantly higher than the hip bone, and right through to a 9 where those pins are significantly lower. And this is what we actually call a measured trait, and we have a number of measured traits within the classification system. There are 2, I think, within the rump traits, being rump angle and pin width, which we'll talk about in a minute, and it's measured in centimetres, lower or higher than level with the pins, with the hips. The pins being level being 0 centimetres, and when it's above, it's plus or below. When it's below, excuse me. And so we see that's way that's calculated. This is a trait that's strongly related with around cows' ability to calve. There's also some research out of Canada recently that shows relationships between some of these rump traits and calf survival after birth. So we find this is a highly important trait, and especially when it's considered within rump. Move to the next slide, please. So pin width. This is a really interesting trait. We're looking, with pins, we're looking for significantly wider pins, and it's a measured trait, and it's the centimetres distance between the most posterior, or the pointiest, the bit sticks out the most in the pin bone at the back, and that's a centimetre. Measured in centimetres and then converted into a linear code, being 1 narrow or 9 extremely wide. And again, it's a trait that's got some relationships with the cow's ability to calve. And what I probably didn't mention around rump angle, where rump angle and pin width are different, obviously very different traits, but rump angle is an extreme, where we have a desire to see an extreme 9 wide, whereas rump angle, we're looking for an intermediate, or some people call a Goldilocks trait, where they're looking for a trait in the middle of around 5 or 6. So if we go on to the next trait, which should be loin strength. So this is loin strength is, unlike rump angle and pin width, which are measured traits. This is a trait that's evaluated by our classifiers subjectively when they look at the cow, and you're looking for a stronger loin. And if you look at the diagrams there, and I'll admit the diagrams aren't great, it's a really hard trait to describe in a diagram. But you're looking for the bridging between that loin from the hips forward to be up high and strong. And also when you actually look down on the cow, you can actually see, and we don't have a photo of it unfortunately, but is to see the real strongly attached loin that it attaches to the vertebrae in the front of the cow. Again, this is a trait where we're obviously looking for extreme strength. We're not looking for an intermediate, we're looking for a 9 strong in this trait. And again, it's a trait that's got relationships with calving ability and the survival of the calf after birth, because how easy that birth has been. So if we go to the next trait, which should be thurl. It's a thurl placement, and Michelle, you talked a little bit about thurl before. So thurl, we don't have a breeding value for. We're collecting data on that now. That data is contributing to the rump the final rump score, and that rump score goes through to DataGene to calculate the overall rump breeding value. So it is contributing in that space, but it is not. We don't yet have its own breeding value, and that's something we'll address as we get more individual data for Thurl. And what you're looking for is, again, this is an intermediate trait. It is not a measured trait though, and you're looking for that Thurl to be in the middle point. So if you look at that the point of the hip bone at the bottom, and you're looking for that triangle between the hips and pins at the top, the bone in the middle, it should be in the middle rather than back or forward. And Thurl has a contribution in two places. It contributes in rump, but it also contributes within feet and legs. And it has a contribution in rump because of, again, that relationship with calving ability and calf survival. And so we're looking for an intermediate. I think the ideal for Thurl is either 5 or 6. And so that's what you're looking for, that trait to be in the middle. Don't want them too far back or too far forward, because that will cause both difficulties with mobility and also some difficulties with calving. That's good there. So, like as I said, we have the 4 traits within the rump composite. There are also some defects listed to the right: advanced anus, advanced tailhead, recessed tailhead, high tailhead, and wry tail. Again, these are traits that the classifier can identify, whether, if a cow has an advanced anus or a recessed tailhead, and these traits certainly have relationships with both calving and also some issues around fertility, especially if you see things like advanced anuses or recessed tailheads where the cow's unable to excrement, to get rid of excrement properly, and that's retained and results in infections. So those things contribute to the rump score. There's no breeding values, obviously, for those defects, but they contribute to the rump score. So if a cow has one of those, it gets a minus against its rump composite, and that will then flow through to DataGene in that rump composite and be related to both the cow and her sire and progeny's breeding values. But you can see, all the rump traits are fairly evenly weighted. Rump angle, pin width 24, 21. Loin strength we place quite a weighting on. We feel that's a very, very important trait for setting up the back part of the cow at 32 and Thurl at 23, being relatively even with the other rump traits. So I think that covers me off, Michelle.
Can I ask a question, Rowan, about the blue highlights on where you've shown the ideals?
Yep. So we talked about those are the ideals. So the way the class system works there is that we evaluate the animals for a linear score, or provide a measurement which is then converted to a linear score based on the animal's age, like number of lactations and stage. And once it's converted to that linear score, the rump score is calculated using those ideals that are highlighted. So if a cow is, let's say she's 5 for rump angle, then she'll have a high rump score. She doesn't get any penalty, but if she is a 2 or 1 or a 8 or a 9, she'll get a significant penalty against her rump score. Same again with pin width, but we're looking for cows to be a 9 for that. And if the cow is less than 9, if she's say 6, well, she'll get a penalty against her rump score as well. So it's sort of almost like you start with a total amount of rump score, and you lose points the further you are from ideal. It's probably the way to think about how we arrive at those composite traits. Does that help answer that question?
That's great. Thanks, Rowan.
So this is a bit of work we did, Michelle, you and I sort of dreamed up and put together to try and create some real life or generate, an understanding between what actually happens in the field and the breeding values. And so across the top, you have the 90, 95, 100, 105, 110, which is the standard, 5 is the standard deviation for all of these traits. And this allows us to sort of say, well, if you've got a bull at 90, what do his daughters look like? Or a bull at 100, what do his daughters look like for each of these traits? What's the difference between a standard deviation for a bull? And you can see there's quite a difference for some of these traits, especially if you look at a trait like pin set, where you're talking 1.5 codes between 90 and 100. That's and if you're looking to get to ideal, where you're talking about bulls that are at the, talking about bulls at that other end, that closer to that extreme. breeding value. So hopefully this is able to help breeders and users of breeding values to identify bulls when they're if they're looking to improve in a trait area, they can understand which way and where they want to go with that trait, and also allow them, to understand what should I expect when I do that. Obviously, there's some basis around when you use that data on where you start from and where you will end up, of course. And this is very much averages, but I think it provides it's a useful resource in that space.
And if you've got some information, Rowan, how could you apply this if you had some classification data, for example, from your own herd? What might that help you with here?
Yeah, so obviously, if you've got classification data, you maybe identify some weaknesses within your own herd, and then say if that weakness was in pin set, and you wanted to make an improvement in pin set, this will allow you to go and do that. But maybe if you looked at your herd and you don't have an issue within pin set, and maybe your average score for pin set is a 5 and you're close to ideal, well then maybe you don't need to apply pressure to pin set, but there is another trait. It could be loin strength, it could be a type trait from another composite. And that's obviously going to be coupled with, other issues and things that you're seeing on your farm. If you're not having issues in this space with fertility and calving ease, well then maybe it's not a space to be focusing on, but maybe it is an area, and this is an opportunity to help with fixing issues in that space. And obviously, if anyone's interested in class data or we're always happy to talk to people about how we can get their cows evaluated if they want to get evaluations done. Small plug. But that's certainly how I would anticipate people are using this information.
Great, thanks, Ron. So the Rump composite ABV is just one composite that contributes to the overall type ABV for an animal. So the overall type ABV, when we made the update to the model in April, now includes the whole range of composites that now make up overall type. And this is a difference compared to previous, where we weren't utilizing that composite data from Holstein, Australia. So this is a nice improvement to the way that we evaluate this particular trait. So the composites that contribute to overall type include mammary, feet and leg, dairy strength, and rump, as well as the final score of the animal. Now, if the animals are older animals, historical animals, and we don't have these composites, then we can use the old overall type model to make sure that we've got a good breeding value for those animals as well. So if you think about how to kind of, use this information, I think the new composite traits are really helpful to be able to allow farmers to breed cows by using kind of summary type ABVs for the big groups: rump, feet and legs, dairy strength, mammary, and overall type. And if we want to improve those type ABVs, then we are looking for animals that have an ABV of greater than 100. 100 is the breed, is the average. So the breeding values are expressed above or below an average of 100. The Good Bulls Guide and Good Bulls app are useful places to go to find this information, and you'll see that the Good Bulls app recently has been updated to include the composite ABVs. Now have a look at the app that's on your phone as we speak. See if it's got those composites. If you don't see them, it might be useful to uninstall and reinstall that app. Sometimes phones don't upgrade exactly the same way. So if you haven't spotted those composites, just delete that copy and download a fresh copy of the app so that you've got the most recent information, including the full range of new traits. You might also have noticed on DataVat, when we look up animals, whether they're bulls or cows, the additional composites have been added to DataVat so that you can look them up using that website as well. And if you're interested in kind of reading more about the new ABVs, you'll find a suite of resources on the DataGene website, so www.datagene.com.au. In learning resources, you'll find fact sheets that are really quick reads, just 1 or 2 pages, tech notes that are great for breeding enthusiasts who want a little bit more detail. And if you want to read the full bottle, there's genetic backgrounders, which are, maybe 10 or 15 pages with a lot more detail. So that's available for you to download if you want to have another look. At this point, it's important for us to kind of to recognize the contribution of the research teams that back the new breeding values that DataGene has been able to release. So our collaborators and partners at Dairy Bio, Agriculture Victoria, Gardner Foundation, and Dairy Australia are really important to developing new models that help us improve the breeding values that are released to farmers and to industry. They couldn't do that work, though, without the data that's supplied by farmers that classify their cows, breed organizations that manage the classification service, herd test centers, as well as dairy software providers. So a big thank you to those that are contributing to the new breeding values. At this point in time, I think we've come to the end of our kind of overview of Rump ABV today. Certainly happy to take any questions that might pop up if you've got some that you'd like to share.
Michelle, one question that comes to mind is around the inclusion of interval data. Obviously, there are traits, and Rump is scored globally, but there are other traits that are incorporated. How does that all work from a DataGene perspective to get those breeding values to work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We obviously, we appreciate the collaboration that we have with Interval to allow us to take information that's collected in other countries and incorporate that with the Australian performance information to deliver an ABV. And that works really well for the traits that Interval evaluates. I've actually got a little slide here. The case is a little bit different for the Rump ABV. This is not a trait that's evaluated by Interval, so we don't have that extra data that comes in from overseas on overseas animals. So the Rump composite ABV that we release from DataGene really relies on information that's available in Australia. So if that bull is a young genomic bull or a bull that has overseas daughters, in both of those cases, we're relying heavily on the parent average breeding value for Rump ABV based on Australian data, as well as the genomic value, because most of these animals are now, we now have a genotype attached to, and that also is really heavily reliant on Australian performance data in the reference population that drives the genomic value. And both of those then contribute to the Rump composite ABV, but it's very heavily reliant on Australian information. When that bull goes on to add its own Australian daughters, then we can combine the parent average breeding value, as well as the Rump scores from that bull's own daughters, as well as the genomic value, which again is heavily influenced by Australian information in the reference population to deliver the Rump composite ABV. So you'll notice in here, we don't have a component that comes from Rump composite scores from overseas animals. Now, the interesting bit is within the components of Rump, you might, for example, have pin width that has extra information from overseas animals through Interval, because it is an Interval trait, but that doesn't deliver or doesn't contribute to the overall Rump composite ABV. So it's good to keep in mind for Rump and for dairy strength, a couple of the composites, we don't have that extra Interval information to add, so it's really reliant on Australian data. Does that help, Rowan?
Yeah, for sure. Look, it's obviously good given we now have, these days we have genomic breeding values that really props or builds up the accuracy of those scenarios where we don't have Interval data on those foreign bulls. So I think it's really good.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that's most of the questions that have come through. Thanks everyone for taking a little bit of time at lunchtime today to have a look at the Rump ABV. You'll notice that next week we have another webinar coming up. It's on feet and legs. So if you're interested in a bit more on feet and legs, please join us next week for that opportunity. And we'll continue this series for a few weeks on various traits, just to provide some extra information about how the ABVs are calculated and expressed and shared with you. Hope you have a fantastic afternoon and have a good day, everyone. Bye now.
Thanks, Joe.